This was just like the exclamation point on a particularly violent sentence.
While researching for this podcast, I sat down and spoke with Dr. Thomas Aiello, a professor of history, Africana studies, and anthrozoology. We will be using clips from that interview throughout this episode. I want to make it very clear that Dr. Aiello's views do not reflect the views of anyone at this podcast or vice versa. We spoke to him specifically as a reliable source on Valdosta, as well as Black history in general, not about Kendrick Johnson. If you don't like what we have to say, that's fine, but do not go and hassle him about our views simply because he was kind enough to lend us his time. Thank you.
I teach Black history at my university, and 90% of my classes are Black students. And it's not because all the white students are, bigots. It's because they don't see that as something for them. They don't see that doesn't have anything to do with me, so I'm not going to take that class. And it's one of the great mistakes that they make because you can't understand places like Valdosta without understanding Black history. And frankly, with the way we have interacted with each other over the past 200 years, there's no way to understand white people without understanding Black history. So, but it's those kind of assumptions that lead to inevitable problems down the line when the people who are actually bigots take advantage of that apathy and use it to either, let's say, kill somebody or to cover something up and decide not to investigate it properly.
I asked a Black man how he knows racism is alive and well against Blacks in the Deep South. I asked him if people were cruel to him or if he was refused services. He said, quote, "No, it's not in your face anymore. I see it in the eyes of people who stop me on the sidewalk and ask me how I'm doing when I jog in a neighborhood I don't live in. I see it when my friends and family tell me that they're having a really hard time getting a car loan or a mortgage even though they have great credit ratings and are perfectly qualified. I see it when again and again a white person is hired instead of a Black person even if their qualifications are identical." He did not want to be named. I spoke to several Black people when I was doing the research for this podcast. I can't tell you any of their names. You aren't safe in Valdosta, Georgia, when you have your own opinion on the Kendrick Johnson case. And maybe that's because feeling safe having Jackie and Kenneth Johnson's opinion was hard-earned with blood, tears, and loss over centuries of systematic oppression and abuse. If you lived in Valdosta and someone asked you for a fun fact about your town, you might say that the composer of the iconic Christmas song Jingle Bells, James H. Pierpoint, was from Valdosta. Or you might say in 1902 a circus elephant went on a rampage after killing its trainer and terrorized the town for a couple of hours before being shot just outside of town and buried on site. So there is an elephant buried just outside city limits. But you probably wouldn't bring up what Valdosta is actually most famous for: the lynching of Mary Turner. Just a heads up, the following clip is quite graphic. Tom also mentions debt peonage, which we will be explaining in detail later.
Our most famous incident in Valdosta was the lynching of Mary Turner, even though it didn't actually happen in Valdosta. It happened in one county over in Brooks County. That is part of our quote-unquote metropolitan area. And all of the newspaper reports at the time came out of Valdosta because Valdosta was the hub of this region. And so it has been forever associated with Valdosta. It started on I don't want to say plantation, but let's just say a budding agribusiness farm in Brooks County, which were notorious for using debt peons. Debt peonage was a way to get slave labor without moving through the criminal justice system. And Hampton Smith, this farmer in Brooks County, was one of the guys who did that. And he had this farm where Black debt peons worked, and among them were the Turners. who lived there along with several others. One day there was an uprising. He was notoriously cruel to the people who worked there, and so he there was an uprising there, and someone on the farm killed him, um, and that led to whenever black Southerner kills a white Southerner, historically speaking, that always means a mass of retributive violence. And certainly that's what happened here. There was a full on lynching party or a race riot wherein a mob of white people chased down everybody they thought was associated with that event and lynched them all, um, including among the people they lynched was Hayes Turner. Mary Turner was his wife, and there are two versions of the story. One version of the story is that she was taken after he was taken, leaving only their small child as the child watched them being taken out and killed. The other version of the story is that she died because she was protesting the fact that they took her husband and nobody did anything about it. Some people said it was because of that. Some people said it was because she was uppity in the moment and tried to stop them from taking her up. Whatever it was, they took Mary Turner, who at the time, it was said at the time that she was 8 months pregnant, and they carried her to the border between Brooks County and Lowndes County, right on the river. They hung her, but they didn't hang her by the neck like they lynched all the men. They hung her up by the feet. They set her clothes on fire, burned them off. They cut open her abdomen, pulled out the fetus, took turns stomping it to death, and then everybody got to take a turn shooting the body until she was finally dead. That was how the story ended up being told. And it became notorious around the country because, again, no police action. There were actually police in that crowd. But the NAACP, which had been founded less than a decade earlier, this was all happening in 1918, had started to investigate these kind of things, knowing that the police didn't do it. And they sent down Walter White, who would later go on to become the head of the NAACP and run it for decades, one of the most important civil rights leaders in American history. But he was still a 20-something-year-old kid at this point. He was brand new to the job. They sent him down. He investigated and writes this kind of blistering report about what really happened to Mary Turner. And for the first time, the country heard about Valdosta. And it is still what we are most known for to this day. And so Mary Turner and her shadow kind of hang over all of our race relations in town. Everyone is cognizant of it, whether you are Black in Brooks or Lowndes County and just have to live with the institutional memory of that kind of unjustified violence and unpunished violence that kind of can happen, that everybody can just kind of let it go and not really worry about it anymore. Or if you're white and you're one of the good old boys who goes down and gets drunk and shoots up the marker because you don't care and because you still believe very much in white supremacy. So in everybody's mind, Mary Turner is just kind of always there. And everybody knows that if you come to Valdosta, the one thing you know about us is Mary Turner. And it has an effect on everyone's mindset in town. It's always kind of just looming in the back there that we are that place. And we have tried to replace it over the years, especially with high school football and things like that, which has sometimes worked and sometimes not. But still, the one thing people think of when they think about Valdosta is Mary Turner.
Maybe you didn't catch it, but Professor Aiello said that good old boys like to go down and shoot the marker. There was a marker to memorialize the lynching of Mary Turner on the site itself, which had to be removed. Reverend Floyd Rose also had this to say on Mary Turner in the documentary Unfortunate: What Happened to Kendrick Johnson.
That was the beginning of something in this area that nobody has quite forgotten, even those who were not there. When you mention it, right, who heard about it, rarely want to talk about it. But it was the beginning of something in Lowndes County that's called fear. Even now, this is 2014. Very few black men, if any, who are at least 55 years old and have never been out of Valdosta or Lowndes County can look in the eyes of a white man when they're talking to him. That's how fearful these people are down here, and don't understand people like me who tell them you don't need to do that. Mm-hmm.
A Confederate monument stands on the grounds of the Lowndes County Courthouse in Valdosta, erected in 1911. For over 100 years, the monument has stood as a testament to the perceived moral victory, but not actual victory because they lost, of the Confederacy, who led the expansion of the white supremacist policies of the Jim Crow era. For over 100 years, people who were once kept in chains have been told that they are getting a fair trial a few feet from a monument dedicated to those who were willing to die to keep them in chains.
They're prevalent. Our courthouse lawn still has its Confederate monument. All southern state houses, southern county courthouses in the South have a Confederate monument. They were all put there by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the 1920s and 1930s as part of what we know as the Lost Cause, when we really started to institutionalize that iconography. We still have Confederate flags flying everywhere and everything else. Those are probably the two most in-your-face symbols that you see. The other symbols are less visible to the naked eye, but are still there and felt by everyone who lives there. For example, they're the way we do neighborhood segregation, and how there are the white neighborhoods and the black neighborhoods. There is literally a railroad tracks, and there is a wrong side of the railroad tracks. I mean, there is literally that kind of trope is in play in Valdosta. So all of those kinds of different ways that people can feel like they aren't really a part of society, whether it's seeing a flag on a pickup truck or driving past the courthouse and seeing a Confederate monument, or just knowing that there are certain neighborhoods that are at least relatively off limits to you, even though it's not formally off limits. That has an effect. I mean, every time that happens, it is a slight diminishment to a person's humanity and their sense of citizenship.
They walked down streets named for slave owners or Ku Klux Klan leaders in a town named after the plantation of Governor George Troup, which was cultivated by his personal workforce of black slaves.
Of course. I mean, we have several movements among students and grad students at my university to try to get some of the street names changed in Valdosta. Just recently, a year or two ago, they finally got Forest Street changed. Forest with two R's, named after Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, which was a street where almost the entirety of the people who lived on that street were black, and they had to live on Forest Street. And so they got that changed finally, but there are still so many streets named after slaveholders or Jim Crow governors that so, I mean, even in just the street signage, you see it. And if you have any kind of understanding of regional or state history, which a lot of people don't, a lot of people just see a street sign. I mean, you don't have to read history books to get around every day, but for those who do, they know. I mean, it has to have an effect that this street is glorifying someone who would have murdered me if they had the opportunity, and that is something that people like me never have to think about. And I can only imagine what that must be like. And so, yes, absolutely, it does very much condition the both the spatial geography and the mental geography of a place like Valdosta. Very much condition you to a certain way of being in a place that really does have an effect. that it's impossible not to notice once you start noticing.
First-time Black homeowners can find affordable homes in lovely Plantation Point, south of Valdosta. Everywhere they go, they are reminded of how it wasn't that long ago that they would have been spat on, abused, exploited, or killed just for the color of their skin. Valdosta was established in 1860 when the Atlanta and Gulf Railroad refused to build a railroad track next to what was Lowndes and Brooks County's largest city, Troopville, named after then-Governor George Troup. With no railroad access, Troopville became a deserted village, or rather an old field with scarcely a vestige of the village remaining, and Valdosta was built alongside the new railroad tracks. In the film Finding Kendrick Johnson, it is implied that because it was on the railroad, Valdosta, at least for a few years before the start of the Civil War, was a trading hub for slaves. If so, I wasn't able to find any record of that, possibly because all county records were destroyed in a fire in 1869. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, just a year after Valdosta was established, but no battles ever actually took place in or near Valdosta due to its remote location. This made it safe haven for families of Southern refugees who escaped to Valdosta after their homes were destroyed in the war. Many of these refugees were Black slaves who were freed by the North. As a result, the cotton plantations received a surge of labor, allowing Valdosta to expand. The vast majority of Valdosta and Lowndes County's economics depended on what the South called king cotton. By 1880, Valdosta had become the largest inland market for Sea Island cotton in the world. After the Civil War ended in 1865, a northern garrison was placed in Valdosta, inhabited by primarily Black soldiers, freedmen who were former slaves in the area. Tensions were extremely high, and there were countless altercations between the soldiers and local residents. In 1868, African American men won the hard-earned right to vote. With this knowledge in hand, a congressional candidate named J.W. Clift, referred to in the newspapers of the time as a prowling, sniveling booby, vagrant scalawag, or carpetbagger, came to the area seeking support from former slaves. He had previously been running for the position of mayor of Savannah, Georgia, but in a mass gathering of the freedmen, he had been nominated as the radical candidate for U.S. Congress. In his campaign speech, he attacked the local whites and appealed to the freedmen in what was considered a hateful and indignant manner towards the white community. In response to this, 5 young white men decided that they were going to set off explosive at Clift's next rally. But when they realized that there were many white people in the crowd, they changed their mind and managed to stop all but one of the explosives from detonating. Luckily, the explosion did not injure anyone. The deputies in the town immediately arrested the men and said that they would call a trial, but Northern soldiers took possession of these men and brought them to Savannah to stand trial. The local population was very upset by this because in their minds, this was another example of the North usurping their right to self-government. After trials in Savannah, which did find them guilty, these young men were basically given a slap on the wrist and none of them spent any time in prison. Clift would go on to win the seat in the House of Representatives. In 1910, Valdosta was ranked the richest city in America by Fortune magazine. Their wealth almost entirely came from king cotton. In a turn of events that was almost biblical, the area experienced an infestation of boll weevils, an insect which subsists primarily on the cotton bud. Within a few years, nearly all of the cotton plants were gone, bringing an end to king cotton, and agriculture shifted to tobacco and pine timber. In 1918, about 20 miles west of Valdosta, Mary Turner and her unborn baby were lynched in Brooks County, Georgia. The shockwave was felt through Lowndes County and beyond, prompting an estimated 500 Black people to flee the area to escape the violence. For those that stayed, the situation did not improve, and by 1922, local chapters of the Ku Klux Klan were holding rallies openly in the town square.
With the Confederate monument, with the flags, with the Trump rallies, and all of that kind of white supremacist stuff that happens in Valdosta, that legacy of the 19 teens and 20s, wherein we were getting these lynchings and wherein we were having Ku Klux Klan marches and cross burnings and all kinds of things like that. It looks eerily familiar. And it's hard for a lot of people in Valdosta, particularly people of color, to feel like we have made all that much progress.
As much as conditions have improved in the area over the last 100 years, outside of Atlanta especially, there is still a problematic history. In 1998, a black man named Willie J. Williams died under police watch in Lowndes County. Here's the story as Reverend Rose tells it.
Willie Williams was a 49-year-old black man who was driving on the wrong side of the street down South Lee Street in the 700 block. He was looking for an address. He was stopped by a sheriff's deputy named Kevin Farmer. 25 hours later, he was lying in his jail cell with cracked ribs, a broken neck, his jaw swollen, and he was lying in his own vomit, dead. The community came together under our leadership, and we marched on the Lowndes County Jail, some 12 to 1,500 strong, and demanded justice for him. It was the first time in the history of Lowndes County that many black folk assembled to protest anything. One of the most interesting things about that whole case was that Johnny Cochran had his lawyer from his law firm in Columbus, Georgia, to call me late one night and ask me about it and said he was coming down here. He did. And they spent $100,000 on investigations. And unfortunately, when they had sued the Lowndes County and the then Sheriff Ashley Polk for $12 million, 9/11 hit, and 3 days later, a substitute judge, that was not even the original judge on the case, decided there was not enough evidence to proceed with the case, and we were all disappointed.
You did hear that name right. While he was not the one who was charged, Ashley Polk was the sheriff at the time. We did speak with Polk for this project, and we want to be transparent about what we know and what you should know. The alleged perpetrator was a sheriff's deputy named Kevin Farmer. Sheriff Polk is the one that brought Deputy Farmer under charges. On October 16th, the United States Department of Justice released the following statement. Quote, "The Justice Department today announced that it has closed the investigation into the death of Willie J. Williams, a Valdosta, Georgia resident, and has found insufficient evidence to justify federal criminal civil rights charges against Kevin Farmer, a Lowndes County Sheriff deputy. The Civil Rights Division opened an investigation into the death of Williams after allegations were made by a People's Tribunal, a Valdosta community activism organization, that he may have been the victim of unlawful excessive force either at the arrest scene or while in jail. On the morning of September 1st, 1998, Williams was arrested after Deputy Farmer stopped him on a traffic violation. In the process of making the arrest, Williams resisted, and according to Deputy Farmer, during the ensuing struggle, he pushed Williams to the ground in order to control him. After receiving medical treatment for injuries sustained in the struggle, Williams was taken to the Lowndes County Jail. Later that evening, while in Lowndes County Jail, correctional officers found Williams jerking violently on the floor of his cell, experiencing a seizure. Medical staff treated Williams and monitored him through the evening. The following morning, he was found unconscious and was pronounced dead at the South Georgia Medical Center. The autopsy determined that Williams died as a result of complications arising from a large subdural hematoma, which was sustained as a result of blunt force head trauma. The examination did not reveal any evidence of other significant or life-threatening trauma. Dr. Anthony Clark, who conducted the autopsy, concluded that the head trauma was consistent with the witness accounts of the fall at the arrest scene and that brain atrophy and liver disease caused by chronic alcoholism significantly contributed to Williams' death. In evaluating the case, the Department of Justice consulted the autopsy report, physical evidence at the scene, including a video recording of the arrest from the deputy's vehicle, video footage from the jail booking room, and more than 50 eyewitness accounts. As a result of its investigation, the Department of Justice determined that the evidence was insufficient to contradict Deputy Farmer's claim that he pushed Williams to the ground in order to control him. Additionally, there was insufficient evidence that Williams was beaten at the jail or that the actions or inactions of any correctional officer resulted in his death. Given that the evidence was insufficient to meet the rigorous requirements for a prosecution under the applicable federal statutes, the Department of Justice has determined that federal criminal civil rights charges are not warranted. To bring federal criminal civil rights charges, the evidence must support the conclusion that the officers willfully deprived Williams of his constitutional right to be free from the use of unreasonable force, and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officers acted with a bad purpose and with the specific intent to use force that they knew was unreasonable. In this case, the evidence was insufficient to establish these elements beyond a reasonable doubt. The mentioned witness statements say that Williams fell during the arrest onto a curb with his hands behind his back, causing more severe injuries due to not having the use of his hands to brace himself. I was unable to find confirmation of a broken neck. Stefan DJ Wangadi Edgerton, featured on Unsolved Mysteries, was another black man of Lowndes County that was unfortunately killed.
Stefan was the musician here at Serenity Church for about 3 months. And then we hired someone else, and he moved back to the church where he was, New Hope Baptist Church. He was a fine young man. I didn't know a lot about him except what I saw here, and he was a fine young man. He had a lovely wife and 3 wonderful children. Somewhere around midnight in, I believe, 2010 or 12, he was killed just outside of the place where he worked at a radio station, shot dead. I listened to the tape. It was 12 minutes long, his last words on earth. He talked about being shot. He talked about how he felt, and he said that he was shot by a pistol, and that pistol was in the hands of a white man. I went to the wake, and I said to the crowd that had assembled there that unless we protest in large numbers, nothing's going to happen.
Right.
Unfortunately, for the last several months, several years now, I should say, nothing has happened. He left behind a widow and 3 wonderful children. I'm still hopeful that we will find his killer.
The person that shot him thought they left him dead, not knowing that he wore a headset for his earpiece, and he had dreadlocks, and it was underneath there, and he was a fighter. He was probably in his heart thinking about how to get back to me and my children, our children, and the Lord gave him that time to be able to call and reveal, so they couldn't make it be a black on black crime like they probably wanted to make it be. He left them where it is a known fact that it was a white male that shot him down. And if my husband said that, I believe him. He left me with that, and he does not want me to let it go. I promised my children, and I'm not letting it go.
The following 7 seconds of audio is the only part of the 911 call that has been released.
911 emergency. What's your emergency? Do you know who shot you?
No. Someone, a white man.
The murder took place on the evening of January 20th, 2012, only 1 year before the death of Kendrick Johnson. Edgerton's murder remains unsolved to this day, but the investigation seems to have revealed that whoever killed him was probably lying in wait behind the studio and ambushed him from behind. It is the opinion of the Lowndes County Sheriff Department that Edgerton knew his killer, and they feel confident that individual, an African-American male, was murdered in a drug-related shooting a few years after Edgerton. The family and the community stand firm that Edgerton would not have said it was a white man unless he was confident, and that if he knew the individual, he would have said so in the 12-minute 911 call. It's possible that the position of the Sheriff's Department on this case is what led to Sheriff Chris Prine being elected sheriff from 2012 to 2016. However, Polk was re-elected in 2016 for another term. It's also almost certainly part of why the public immediately looked for signs that the sheriff's office wouldn't investigate the death of Kendrick Johnson properly, which they found in Prine and Taylor's first statement released the evening his body was found, that there were at that time no signs of foul play. I would consider what you've just heard to be the introduction to this episode. It should help you understand the mindset of the people of color in Valdosta a little bit more than if we hadn't talked about it at all. Young men dying is always a tragedy, and historically when young black men died, it was often disgustingly often, a violent death at the hands of white men. And it was often, revoltingly often, swept entirely under the rug by the people who were duty-bound to protect and serve. I wish I could say it doesn't still happen in 2024, but that wouldn't be true. For those of you who are interested in a deeper look at Black history and the context it provides in this case and any other case of the Black community rallying around a young Black life cut tragically short, let's continue. For those of you who are not interested, you probably need this education most of all, so sit down and listen anyway. All I'm going to say about the pre-war history is that at the inception of what came to be America, there were some Black people, some white people, some Black indentured servants, some white indentured servants, and a few slaves, not all of whom were Black. There is a long and very horrifying history of the experiences of Black people in early America, particularly involving how Black people were systematically stripped of their rights as free people to force them into an underclass. Of what I am going to cover, it is really an extremely brief overview. To tell the whole story would be impossible. There's a reason people are able to get entire degrees in this topic. After the American War of Independence, which officially gave the American states and territories their independence from Great Britain, the leaders of the new fledgling country drafted the Constitution of the United States. It was signed in 1787 and proclaimed all men are created equal, ignoring the fact that millions of people all across America were actually living in bondage. 25 of the 55 delegates who were involved in the drafting of the Constitution owned slaves themselves, including the first president of the United States of America, George Washington. He, in fact, owned hundreds. The White House was built on the backs of Black slaves who constructed the very tunnels beneath it they used to move about without being seen by the public. Even though the Constitution never uses the word slave, there are provisions for the continuation of slavery in the Constitution. The first of these is the 3/5 Compromise. The North didn't want Southern states to be able to count any of their enslaved people as citizens when it came to representation in Congress, but the South wanted to count all of them. What this means is the amount of representatives a state gets in Congress is dependent upon the population of that state. The South would boost their representation and voting power by including their slaves, who have no actual constitutional rights, in the population total. The Founding Fathers conceded to allow them to use 3 out of 5 of their enslaved people towards the total because they felt that if they refused altogether, Georgia and North Carolina would refuse to join the Union. It's extremely important to understand that at the time, the Founding Fathers' main focus was simply to strengthen and solidify the Union to maintain their foothold out from under British rule. The second provision became known as the Fugitive Slave Clause, which requires, quote, "No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due." Translation: as a slave, if you escape into a state with different laws or regulations, you are still subject to the laws and regulations of the state where the slave owner resides. Your slave owner can claim you at any time, take you back, and put you back under the whip. This was another concession to the South. The Southern states were concerned that their slaves were escaping and finding refuge in the Northern states, so they wanted a law made to guarantee their slaves would be returned to them as any other property might. In 1793, the South demanded an amendment to the Fugitive Slave Clause. As it was, the clause did not prevent people in the North from offering their slaves refuge and refusing to return them to the South. A big part of this Northern resistance came from the knowledge that the South had been using the Fugitive Slave Clause to kidnap and enslave free men in the North, claiming that they were their property and they had every right to take them. George Washington responded to this demand by creating what became known as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This amendment made it so anyone caught providing refuge to Southern slaves could be fined up to $500. That would be the equivalent of about $16,000 today. Knowing that the North couldn't fight back without risk to their quality of life, slave catchers became prominent in the North, rounding up escaped slaves or, failing that, kidnapping Northern men. The law stipulated that there was no proof necessary that the person that had been captured was actually a runaway slave. All that was needed was the word of the capturer. George Washington himself actually tried to make use of the law when one of his young female slaves had escaped when she was told that she was going to go live with one of the Washington daughters. Washington made it very clear that he did not want her injured in any way and he did not want a big fuss made. The slave catcher sent after her did find her twice, but both times she refused to come willingly, and there was not a lot they could do because of their orders. She ended up escaping, and 50 years later, she said that she was still an escaped slave, and under that law, she and all of her descendants could still be taken and given to the children or grandchildren of George and Martha Washington. In contrast, by 1793, northern states had progressed to the point where not only had they taken a decidedly anti-slavery stance, in fact it would be less than 10 years until every northern state had voted to abolish slavery, but they had also started advocating for the freeing of slaves in the South. Any hope this brought to the enslaved people in the South was snuffed out when, in that same year, the cotton gin was invented. The cotton gin increased the efficiency of harvesting cotton tenfold, and the institution of slavery experienced a spike in lucrativeness that set the abolitionist movement back by decades. It didn't just benefit the plantation owners, it was especially lucrative for the textile industry. All over the country, factories and mills were popping up ready to spin the raw cotton into fiber and turn the fiber into material. The southern states of America had cotton-growing land that surpassed all of the rest in the world combined. It was just the best place for growing cotton in the entire world, which was even beneficial for their overseas trading partners such as Britain and France, who began their own textile industry from just the raw cotton they were receiving. By 1862, 1 in 10 people in Europe made their living in the textile industry. Beginning in 1829, southern states that were growing concerned that teaching slaves to read and write could lead to a push for their liberty began implementing anti-literacy laws. Many slave owners actually did believe that slaves should learn to read for a couple of reasons, one being that they felt it was important that slaves learned the Bible, and two, it helped the well-being, and therefore productivity, of their slaves to be able to read letters from members of their families living on other plantations. After Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, people caught teaching their slaves to read for any reason were fined, and some were even imprisoned. The rampage saw a small group of slaves going from plantation to plantation and killing any white people that they came in contact with, including women and children. Which isn't to imply that white people were in the habit of sparing women and children. When he was caught, after being on the run for about 6 weeks, he and 17 other people who were allegedly involved in the planning and execution of this rebellion were hanged. Their heads were severed and posted on spikes as a warning to any other slaves who may consider doing what Nat Turner had done. Another approximately 120 slaves were slaughtered by the white mobs, even though they almost certainly had nothing to do with Nat Turner's rampage. In addition to these 120 casualties, the spree also had the unfortunate consequence of turning a lot of the members of what had been a growing abolitionist movement against the idea of abolition, as well as silencing the remainder. As far as the majority of the population was concerned, what Nat Turner had done proved that black people were dangerous and needed to be kept in bondage. In 1857, a slave named Dred Scott appeared before the Supreme Court, petitioning them for his freedom. He had been brought to the Free States, Illinois and Minnesota, by his master before he died. Upon the death of his master, Scott's freedom was brought into question. "How can I be enslaved if I am now living in a free state?" he asked the court. His petition went through 7 layers of hearings until it reached the Supreme Court. Their decision read, quote,
"The opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times, and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves, nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as a part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had for more than a century before being regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justify and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. And upon a full and careful consideration of the subject, the court is of the opinion that, upon the facts stated in the plea in abatement, Dred Scott was not a citizen of Missouri within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States, and not entitled as such to sue in its courts."
This decision, which historians have since called the worst decision ever made, was that because when the Constitution was written there were no free black people, they were not citizens then and are not citizens now. The document also found that it was unconstitutional for any government, state or federal, to attempt to ban slavery because it was protected in the Constitution. Many historians believe this decision set the country directly on the path to war. In 1860, two things happened. The 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was elected, and the Civil War began. Lincoln is most closely associated with his Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued in 1863 and proclaimed all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforth shall be, free. I would be reticent if I did not acknowledge that Lincoln's motives when he was elected into office have been questioned. In a letter dated in 1862, he wrote, quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Some people are willing to disregard this quote, instead focusing on his actions during his time in office, as well as before he was elected, in determining what kind of man Honest Abe really was. Others are not so willing. Regardless, Lincoln publicly took a very anti-slavery stance in his 30-year career before being elected, and that is the platform he was elected on. Despite his goal of abolishing slavery, Lincoln admitted he didn't really understand how an integrated society could actually work. His solution would be that black people would live with their own kind in a colony, and they would form their own separate society. Why he felt that way, we could only really speculate, but his views were purportedly changed in 1863 when he met Frederick Douglass, arguably the most famous black man in the world at the time. Despite Douglass being openly critical of Lincoln, and their first meeting being tense, even bordering on hostile, after their second meeting, Douglass became a trusted advisor to the president up until his assassination. There is evidence that Lincoln respected Douglass in all manner of things, even though they did not always agree. In Douglass's autobiography, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, Douglass wrote that after Lincoln's second inaugural address, Lincoln eagerly sought Douglass out in the crowd to ask him his opinion, telling him, quote, "There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours." With the election of Lincoln came the formation of the Confederate States of America. On March 21, 1861, Alexander H. Stephens, intended Vice President of the Confederation, delivered what is known as the Cornerstone Speech, or the Cornerstone Address.
Our new government's foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth.
The states which declared their secession from the Union in 1860 and 1861 were Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, and part of Virginia. These states, excluding Texas and Virginia, were all in the Cotton Belt. The rest of Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina joined the Confederates. Later, Missouri and Kentucky would also join. On April 12, 1861, Confederate troops fired on the Union stronghold in Fort Sumter in South Carolina, starting off the U.S. Civil War by trying to push the Northern garrison out of their home ground. The war lasted for 4 years and resulted in around 620,000 dead. In August of 1861, the North passed the Confiscation Act of 1861. The bill made it so any materials or property that was seized from the Southerners, which was considered contraband, immediately became the property of the North. For the purposes of this bill, this acknowledges slaves as property, and more specifically, contraband. In practice, this bill nullified the Fugitive Slave Clause, allowing the North to free the Southern slaves. For a deeper dive into the Civil War, I recommend the Ken Burns documentary, The Civil War. We'll just be covering some important events here, but spoiler alert, the North won. As mentioned, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, 3 years into the Civil War. While the war was still ongoing, this didn't make the slaves free in practice, but what it did do is allow black men from the South who had fled to the North to join the Union Army. Jefferson Davis, who was the so-called president of the Confederation, issued his own proclamation, saying that any black Union soldier who was arrested would be returned or introduced to a life of slavery. On November 19, 1863, Lincoln gave the famous Gettysburg Address. Prior to this speech, Lincoln had only publicly declared that the war was about keeping the Union together. But now that the North, tired of 2 years of bloody war, was turning on him, Lincoln needed to give the people a righteous cause. Lincoln was also acutely aware that Great Britain would likely come down hard if suddenly America couldn't produce the amount of cotton that their infrastructure was currently relying on. As I mentioned earlier, 10% of Europe's labor force depended on cotton. By the time that Lincoln took the presidency, he was aware that abolishing slavery had the potential to lead to another war like the War of Independence if France and Britain decided to stand with the southern states. Reframing the war as a righteous cause had the planned effect of silencing Europe when it came to the U.S. Civil War. They couldn't interfere now on moral grounds when this was an effort to give human beings their liberty. The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, when General Robert E. Lee surrendered his troops to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Lee later said he chose to surrender because his men were stretched too thin to break through the Union line, and he wanted to prevent further destruction to the South and further loss of his people. On December 16, 1865, the 13th Amendment was signed. It read, quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." The day was momentous, and the 13th Amendment is considered a huge step in the progress being made in the Western world with regards to civil rights. However, the amendment didn't actually implement any consequences to those who continued to enslave people, and as it would turn out, there were a lot of different names you could give slavery. Special Field Order 15, signed on January 6, 1865, reserved 400,000 acres spanning from Charleston, South Carolina, to the St. Johns River in Florida to be given to all the freedmen and their families in 40-acre plots. This has since become known as 40 acres and a mule. Lincoln didn't live very long to enjoy his victory or continue advocating for the freedmen. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in the Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865. Booth was part of a group of rebels who conspired to murder Lincoln, as well as the Secretary of State William H. Seward and the Vice President Andrew Johnson. Seward's would-be assassin only managed to wound him, and Johnson's became too drunk and passed out before killing him. Booth was killed after a 12-day manhunt, and the other members of the rebel group were hanged on July 7, 1865. Among them was the first woman to be executed by the United States government, Mary Surratt. When Lincoln passed away a few hours after being shot in a hotel room across the street from the Ford's Theater, Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, reportedly said either, quote, "Now he belongs to the ages," the most common version repeated throughout history, or, quote, "Now he belongs to the angels," which historians argue is probably more accurate given Stanton's religious beliefs and overall character. After taking Lincoln's place as president, Andrew Johnson, a Southerner himself, famously said, quote, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." He then proceeded to systematically remove all of the freedmen from their land, returning the land and the mule to the white men. The Reconstruction period lasted from 1865 to 1877. The goal was to reintegrate the southern states back into the Union under the new zeitgeist, as well as provide an opportunity for African Americans to create social and economic independence. The dream of economic independence unfortunately died with Lincoln when the land that for many would have been the only means to achieve that dream was rescinded by Andrew Johnson. During this time, the very first black primary and secondary schools for children and the very first universities for black people were established. These would be Fisk and Howard University. Between 1865 and 1867, many freedmen did manage to escape the southern states, but even more were forced to stay behind because they were too poor to leave the plantations. Many who tried to flee died on the way from starvation or fell at the hands of the white mobs. The southern plantation owners worked around the 13th Amendment by having their slaves, who really had nowhere else to go, sign a contract which stipulated that they could continue living on the property as long as they continued fulfilling their current role. The contracts would be drafted to allow all the same treatment as they had suffered before, but with the added humiliation of having agreed to it. Examples of this were being locked or chained up at night, not being allowed to leave the property, having to speak in a servile manner, accepting any form of punishment deemed necessary, and obeying all commands issued by the overseer. While desperation may have been sufficient for the freedmen to sign these contracts, it's likely that a lot of them simply didn't know how to read them because black literacy had been banned for decades by this point. Fortunately, Northern troops still occupying the South discovered these contracts, and within a year most of them had been destroyed. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared all persons born in the United States full-fledged citizens, regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. On July 9, 1868, this officially became the 14th Amendment. Simplified, the 14th Amendment said that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Possibly the most important effect of this act was that it gave black men the ability to vote. President Johnson tried to veto this bill, but he was overridden by Congress. This was the first time in history that had ever happened. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 began what was called Radical Reconstruction, and the former Confederate states were divided into 5 military districts, each commanded by a general who enforced the law. 38,000 Northern troops were stationed in the South, half of whom were African American. Johnson also tried to veto this bill, but again was overridden by Congress. This came hand in hand with the establishment of the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, as an official collective group. The group, which started as a social club for Confederate veterans, became a vehicle for Southern underground resistance to radical Reconstruction. During the Northern occupation, the KKK organized a militia campaign to attack Union troops and lynch entire families of freedmen. They used public humiliation and terrorist methods to snuff out African American independence and try to take control back from the Northern soldiers. The most important goal that the Ku Klux Klan had was to prevent black people from voting. Occupying troops had to guard as many polling places as possible to allow black citizens to vote in 1868. At the ones they weren't able to guard, the KKK had a huge presence and intimidated, or worse, every black voter who tried to enter the polling station to cast a vote. The 1868 election was won by Ulysses S. Grant, general of the Union Army that freed the South from slavery. Much to the chagrin of the KKK, on February 26, 1869, the 15th Amendment was ratified, which specifically said that all black men were allowed to vote. In 1870, President Ulysses S. Grant took great strides to improve the lives of his black constituents. He declared the KKK a terrorist organization, made hate crimes a federal offense, and after several riots and several uprisings were put down by federal troops, he suspended habeas corpus for any suspected members. For anyone who doesn't know, habeas corpus is the requirement for a prisoner to be brought before the court, who determines whether imprisonment is lawful. Essentially, KKK members could be taken straight from rally to prison, do not pass go, do not collect $200. As a result, the KKK was disbanded by 1872. In 1877, Ulysses S. Grant had served his full 8 years, and it was the end of what would be the best years that African Americans would see for a long time to come. The 19th U.S. president was Rutherford B. Hayes, who began his term by ending Reconstruction and reestablishing Home Rule, starting by removing all of the Northern troops from the South. With the power back in their hands, the Southern states rushed to enact sweeping segregation laws that they called Jim Crow. The moniker came from an 1828 minstrel song called Jump Jim Crow, written by Thomas Dartmouth Rice. The song was performed in blackface and was meant to mock black people. It's not clear how this song came to be the codified term for segregation laws.
Every time I wheel about a jump Jim Crow, I went down to the river. I didn't mean to stay, but there I saw so many gals I couldn't get away. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about a jump Jim Crow.
Give me back my clothes, please.
And so it was that a young song and dance man, who was later belovedly known as Daddy Rice, was the first to bring blackface characterization to the American stage.
Segregation was implemented under the guise of being, quote, separate but equal. In the case of establishments, such as restaurants and theaters, there should be a white section and a black section. For facilities, for example, if there was a drinking fountain or washroom, there had to be one for whites and one for blacks. There were some exceptions made to segregation laws. A black nanny for a white family could, if she had with her a white child, use the white facilities. This was also true if any white person had one of their domestic servants with them. In practice, there was really no enforcement of the equal part of separate but equal. Black people would frequently find themselves walking past multiple bathrooms on their way to a bathroom they could actually use, finding themselves in trouble at work for long bathroom breaks or ducking into alleys to relieve themselves and being arrested for exposing themselves in the process. There were also unwritten rules of conduct that black people had to learn through what could be fatal trial and error, that if they didn't follow, they would be subject to violence by white people. Under the Jim Crow laws, black people were expected to behave as second-class citizens and acknowledge that they were inferior to white people. For example, they were expected to step off the sidewalk to let a white person pass, always be submissive, always speak in a servile manner, and of course black men had to be painstakingly careful of any and all interactions with a white woman, because as the case of Emmett Till shows, even just being not as deferential as expected to a white woman could get you killed. Having any kind of physical, let alone sexual contact with a white woman would almost certainly get you lynched. Black mothers taught their sons that they should never ever look at a white girl, and sometimes that wasn't even enough. Accusations of rape tended to crop up whenever a black man or community experienced any kind of success. The numbers of civil rights violations, assaults, and outright mob violence cases being brought to the attention of the federal government skyrocketed. In 1883, the Supreme Court released the following ruling.
When a man has emerged from slavery, and by the aid of beneficent legislation has shaken off the inseparable concomitants of that state, there must be some stage in the progress of his elevation when he takes the rank of a mere citizen, and ceases to be the special favorite of the laws, and when his rights as a citizen, or a man, are to be protected in the ordinary modes by which other men's rights are protected.
Essentially what this meant was that black citizens were no longer going to be protected by the federal government, and they must learn to rely on their local law enforcement as the white men do. As long as the local authorities didn't overtly disobey the amendments that had been put into place to protect black Southerners, they could handle the complaints at their own discretion.
In, the 1890s alone, the American South averaged 188 lynchings per year. There were another 1,000 between 1900 and 1914. They slowed down in the late 20s and the 1930s, but they continued, at least in some measure, till after World War II. And there was never any recompense for these murders. The idea was always that you can kill without consequence if your victim is black, at least in the states of the former Confederacy, and really in a lot of other places as well. And the excuse making that came from law enforcement to justify not prosecuting or not convicting in the cases when they did prosecute offenders was always based on either something that they did to deserve it, whether it be usually some kind of black male contact with a white woman, or they say, well, it was an accident. This was an accident. And so those are the two most common justifications for unpunished white murder of black men from the end of Reconstruction, beginning in the 1880s, all the way until the present day. So whenever you hear that, it's not just a statement. There is a history of a racial kind of coding in that kind of talk that people who kind of understand that legacy, who've had to live with that legacy very much hear. They hear that kind of dog whistling very clearly.
On June 7, 1892, Homer Plessy, who lived in New Orleans, decided that he was going to take a stand against the Separate Car Act, which dictated that there be 4 whites only and 4 coloreds only train cars on all trains. Interestingly, this was actually done with the full cooperation of the train company because, for them, instituting and enforcing separate cars had actually become a real inconvenience. Sometimes they were carrying an extra car that wasn't really needed because neither car was even close to full. They also now had to have a security guard on the train to deal with instances of insubordination or complaint. Homer Plessy was only 1/8 African American, and yet by law that meant he was colored and would have to use the colored-only facilities. But that day, he sat in the whites-only car and refused to move. He was arrested and, as expected, was convicted of breaking the law. This enabled Plessy and his supporters to achieve their goal, which was to have the case escalated to the Supreme Court in order to make them see that segregation was unconstitutional. In 1896, in a 7-1 decision, it was determined that separate but equal segregation was not in and of itself unfair or unconstitutional as long as separate but equal was maintained. This allowed for Jim Crow to continue unchallenged for the next 50 years. Voting was still the most important thing the southern states wanted to keep inaccessible to black citizens. By all means, they wanted to prevent black people from being able to elect anyone who would represent their interests. They tackled this issue by implementing restrictions specifically targeted at black voters. For example, some states said that in order to vote, you had to be literate. Unless you could prove that you had at least a 5th grade education, you needed to be able to prove your literacy. They enforced this through the use of literacy tests. These literacy tests had no answer key, and the person administering the test determined if it was correct or not. There were 30 questions, you had 10 minutes to complete the test, and one wrong answer meant you failed. Theoretically, anyone who could not prove at least a 5th grade education was required to take these tests, but it's well known that they did not make white people take the test. We will leave a link in the show notes to a literacy test that black voters in the 1960s had to take in Louisiana. You'll really have to see it for yourself to understand just how ridiculous this test was, because there's visual components to this test that you need to see. A couple of things that I can explain are that they try to confuse people with the words circle or line. For example, they say things like, circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line. Okay, no problem. But then they say, draw a line around the shortest word in this line. Of course, you can't draw a line around something because then it's a circle, right? Another question is draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence, which as far as I can tell makes no sense no matter what you do. Also, just looking at the test and how long it is and how confusing it is, there's simply no way that anyone can complete this in 10 minutes. So the moment you sit down, you've already failed. Another thing that some states did was to require a poll tax. In order to vote, you had to pay between $1 and $3, and sometimes you have to have paid this tax for the previous 2 years in order to vote in the 3rd year. In Louisiana, you had to own at least $300 worth of property, or you or your ancestors had to be eligible to vote on January 1st, 1867. This, of course, still allowed poor white people to vote because no black people were allowed to vote in 1867. Not being registered to vote also had the effect of making it nearly impossible for any black person to run for office, become sheriff, sheriff's deputy, or justice of the peace. It also meant you could never be called for jury duty. By 1900, black representation in government had fallen to nearly zero. I'm sure at this point, at least some of you are thinking, okay, but what did the South do to ensure that they had the labor force needed to continue harvesting king cotton? Because slavery was illegal and their contract scheme had failed, they had to come up with new ways of maintaining their labor force without actually breaking the law. This is where the black codes came in. If you've ever gotten a chuckle over one of the crazy, specific, outdated laws that are still on the books, such as it being unlawful to sell a chicken after dark, a lot of them probably stemmed from these black codes. These were simply designed to give the authorities an excuse to arrest black people, and they were seldom used against white people even though they were, in the loosest interpretation, laws. Several states had many after-dark laws, which were meant to keep black people off the streets or out of the town altogether at night. Such areas have been called sundown towns. You might be surprised to learn that sundown towns are still alive and well in 2024. We'll leave a link in the show notes to an online database of sundown towns in case anyone is interested in just how prevalent they were, or more likely are. One of the more bizarre and ridiculous laws was that stealing a pig will get you 5 years in prison. At the time, a pig was worth about $1. There were very specific laws against walking on railroad tracks, riding a freight train, gambling, drinking, carrying a knife or even a razor in your pocket, and pretty much everything involving any kind of interaction with a white woman. Of course, sexual conduct was absolutely grounds for lynching in the eyes of some members of the public, but also swearing or speaking too loudly in the presence of a white woman was against the law. Another crazy charge was called reckless eyeballing. This simply meant looking at a white woman with what was deemed to be too much interest. Probably the most insidiously exploited law that was used against people at this time was called vagrancy, which was conveniently up for interpretation, depending on the situation. It could mean simply being unemployed or, quote, just loitering away your time.
That's another one of our big problems. Not only did we have convict lease that killed all kinds of black prisoners, we also very much had debt peonage, wherein the authorities would go and arrest black people for nothing, for like just small things. They turn vagrancy into a crime, all these kind of silly crimes that don't really, just like standing in the wrong place in the wrong time was a crime. And they all were misdemeanors that you had to pay a fine for, which they knew, of course, that these poor Black people could not pay. And so they would arrest all these people, charge them these fines for breaking the law, and then white farmers would come, pay their fine for them, and take them to the farm where they would have to work off the payment for that fine.
As Professor Aiello said, black codes were the excuse that the South needed to transition from slave labor to convict labor. The way this worked in practice was that a deputy would grab a black person, claim that they were breaking some sort of law, such as walking on a railroad track, or in most cases loitering, meaning vagrancy, and take the person to what they call a justice of the peace. Anyone could be a justice of the peace, including innkeepers, tailors, farmers, or plantation owners. The justices were appointed by the county's elected sheriff, who was also in charge of appointing deputies. The same deputies that would seek out and find black people who would theoretically transgress these laws and bring them back to a justice of the peace for sentence. The justice of the peace, of course, would find them guilty of whatever the supposed transgression was, and then sentence them to hard labor. Prisoners were then sold by the government to the highest bidder, who could work them like a mule until their sentence was completed. Within a few years, there were convicts being leased to railroad companies, plantations, farms, and mines. By the time Reconstruction ended in 1877, every southern state had a convict leasing program in place. There were even situations in which child convicts as young as 11 years old were being used by certain industries as laborers. If you're thinking, well, why didn't these people who had probably done nothing wrong try and fight these charges? The simple answer is that part of the justice system is stacked against them too. One example was a man that was charged with gambling for throwing dice on a sidewalk. He got 14 days of hard labor, but that was increased to 114 days of hard labor to cover the court fees. Court fees were incurred when a person accused of a crime decided they were going to try and fight the charge. There would be witnesses called, and a judge would have to sit and hear the case. Judges were not easy to come by and would travel around multiple towns sitting for cases. The longer the case went on, the higher the court fees that would be incurred because the town was required to pay the judge as well as provide accommodation. Of course, in these situations, the black person never won the case. All they did was acquire more court fees and make their sentence even longer. In a lot of these old charges, you'll see the reason for the arrest not given. Not given means that the person didn't even try to fight the charge because they knew that it was pointless. In some of these cases, to prevent the person from even trying to fight against their charge, the justice of the peace would offer them a lesser sentence if they agreed to plead guilty, which now we know as a plea bargain. The court didn't even bother to write down what crime they charged the person for because it didn't matter. From 1870 to 1920, the charge given most often in court records was not given. Debt peonage, extremely similar to convict leasing, was when you were ordered to pay a fine for whatever your supposed transgression was, one you can't afford, and suddenly a white guy, often the same white guy who arrested you, would offer to pay your fine if you agreed to work off your debt to him. What they didn't realize was that for every minute they were there, their debt increased because of the lodgings, clothing, food, and medicine. And the landowner is keeping track of all of this. The debt can never be paid off because the debt never goes down. In the instances where debt peonage resulted in a black person being used for labor, the sheriff, the justice of the peace, and the plantation owner, or whoever wanted these laborers, were all working together. One of the methods that they used to convince freedmen to agree to work off their debt was to tell them that if they can't pay this fine, they'll have to go work in the mines. At that time, 25% of mine workers could be expected to die on the job, and everybody knew it. An account of one such debt peonage farm said that workers were locked up at night, poorly clothed, and often worked with no clothes on at all. Both the men and the women were underfed and made to work from 3 o'clock in the morning until 7 or 8 o'clock at night. If they complained, they were whipped. If a person finally managed to pay off their debt and they were released, they were immediately at risk of being arrested for vagrancy or being unemployed, and the cycle would begin all over again. In 1903, Stanley W. Finch, a Department of Justice investigator, said, quote,
"The system is more cruel and inhuman than the slavery of antebellum days. Since then, the master conserved the life and health of the slave for business reasons just as he did that of his horse or mule. But now the master treated the slave unmercifully, and with the sole object of getting the greatest possible amount of labor out of him. Moreover, a convict costs but a few dollars, while a slave used to cost several hundred.
In other words, if you were among the wealthy enough to own slaves prior to emancipation, you had an incentive to keep them healthy and safe because of the investment you put into them. The convict leasing and debt peonage schemes meant that anyone who could afford about $12 a month had access to slave labor, thus reducing any incentive to protect their life to almost nothing. When labor schemes were discovered and there was an attempt to prosecute, the cases were dismissed because the perpetrators simply said that they couldn't be charged with keeping slaves. As far as the Constitution was concerned, slavery, when done under the guise of convict leasing or debt peonage, wasn't a crime. The 13th Amendment says, quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Because of this, both lasted well into the 20th century. Between the end of the Civil War and 1903, there were over 800,000 cases of people being used as either debt peons or under convict lease. Chain gangs, which you may have seen in cartoons, films, or historical photographs, were made up of convict leases or prisoners who, instead of being leased, were employed by the government, particularly to clean up the mess after the Civil War. They were called chain gangs because they were all chained together at the ankle, keeping full range of motion in their arms but being unable to move quickly or run away. Being chained to a dozen other men meant that your actions had a ripple effect of everyone in the line. So if you step too far or too fast, every other prisoner is thrown out of rhythm. Working 20-hour days under this restriction, prisoners would sometimes lose their tempers and start fights with the person that they felt had been at fault. The problem was that even if the prisoners had no desire to get involved in the altercation, they had no choice but to be pulled along into the fight. This would often lead to large groups of prisoners being punished as being part of the violence, even though they had done nothing wrong. Something we're all lucky to be blissfully unaware of is the fact that when an ankle shackle rubs against your legs all day, every day, it causes deep, festering wounds, and these were known as shackle sores. Infected shackle sores led to gangrene, and when a prisoner died of this condition, it was said that he had died from shackle poisoning. Major areas of the South, such as Charleston, Columbia, Atlanta, and Richmond, were completely destroyed, and chain gangs were put to work cleaning and rebuilding. As the Civil War receded further into the rear view, chain gangs became a driving force in Southern expansion. They were used by the railroad companies, and eventually they built the first highways. But sometimes the chain gangs weren't even doing anything useful. You can't have too many prisoners on one site, especially when they're all chained together, so if there's no actual tasks available, they would find ways for them to still serve their punishment. The conditions under which these men worked were often brutal. Searing heat or freezing cold, it didn't matter. They were out there working from sunup to sundown on whatever project they'd been assigned to. The prisoners were always dressed in some sort of overalls, often with stripes that made it very clear to anyone passing by that these were prisoners. A common pastime for the local Caucasians would be to mosey on down to where the chain gangs were working and swear at them, yell at them, make fun of them, and throw things at them. It was a never-ending contest on who could humiliate them the most. This was never put a stop to by the guards because the penal system at the time felt that was just part of their punishment for whatever they had been put in prison for. The food being fed to the prisoners was the lowest quality available, and they were always underfed. Examples of meals they'd be fed would be water or maybe a little bit of milk, porridge, thin soups or stews made from scraps, and bread that had gone stale. An account from a prisoner said that the prisoners were being served beans, but when he looked into the pot, he saw the carcass of a rat floating there. If someone complained, they were told, "At least you got some meat." As brutal and disturbing as it is to think about, physical punishment was part of their daily lives for every minuscule infraction, or no infraction at all. A common tool used by the guards was called a sweat box. A sweat box was a vertical wooden box that would not allow a prisoner to stand upright, nor could they completely sit down. The usual length of stay in the box ranged from 3 to 7 days. The rations that they were given while they were in there were 2 slices of bread and 1 glass of water per day. I probably don't need to tell you this, but it's hot in the South, and hot days made the box absolute torture, hence the name. You also weren't allowed to use the restroom while you were in there, so you would also have to suffer the indignity of being covered in your own filth until you were set free. When it got cold, particularly after a hot day that left the prisoners soaked in sweat, they could lose their toes to frostbite. I came across an account from one former prisoner who was on a chain gang for 7 years saying that he saw a guard push a fellow prisoner into a vat of creosote. Creosote is a wood preservative that they use to preserve their wooden tools. When it comes in contact with human skin, it can cause deep burns. Luckily, or unluckily, depending on how he felt about it, this prisoner did survive his injuries, but he was left scarred for life. According to the person who told this account, when the guard was asked why he had done this, he said it was to keep all the other prisoners knowing what would happen to them if they didn't stay in line and follow the rules. Sometimes chain gangs would go back to a prison after their workday was done, but often they lived in a camp that was on the work site. In these camps, the men would be shackled together while they slept, and they would sleep in a large cage on wheels, commonly known as circus cage wagons. The guards would squeeze in as many prisoners as they could fit while still being able to lock the cage. And because the cages were open on the sides, they would be subjected to whatever environmental conditions occurred, whether that was the heat, the cold, the rain, or insects like mosquitoes, and if you're at all familiar with the ecologies of the U.S. South, far worse. Chain gangs were used until public outcry over the quality of life that these prisoners endured led to abolishment. For most states, this was done by 1955, but Georgia clung to their gangs until the early 1960s. As we move into the 1900s, the increased prevalence of records gave historians and amateur historians many tales of bravery, ingenuity, and hope. This could be because of technological advancements in sharing information, or simply that more African Americans were becoming literate. It also gave us some truly heartbreaking examples of the effects of white conditioning. To read testimony of former black slaves, where they thank and praise their white masters for teaching them to behave as a human being and not an animal, is deeply upsetting. There's a book called Born in Slavery, Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Project 1936 to 1938, that contains more than 2,300 first-person accounts of slavery and 500 black and white photographs of former slaves. These testimonies were collected throughout the 1930s. The first wave of what is called the Great Migration began in 1910 and continued until about 1940. World War I left countless industrial jobs vacant in major cities, such as Chicago and Detroit, when the able-bodied white men were called to fight. This led to black Southerners migrating into the northern states en masse to fill those roles. A black man working a farm in the South could expect to make about 75 cents a day. However, moving to the northern states and working in automobile manufacturing, meatpacking, or steel and iron works could increase that income as high as $5 a day. In 1910, 90% of black Americans lived in the South. By the end of the first wave in 1940, that figure dropped to 77%. While the potential for making a living was a significant motivating factor, the constant threat of terror as a black person living in the South provided enough motivation on its own that they likely would have migrated north for similar wages anyway. Conditions were certainly better there during the war for the black workforce, but there was a striking change in the atmosphere when the white locals returned from war to find the social landscape had been radically changed, and competition for the limited opportunities in post-war America had increased. There was also a growing fear that black servicemen would be unwilling to resubmit to the status quo upon their return, especially after having received combat training and better treatment in Europe. This combination of anger and fear led to hundreds of deaths in the summer of 1919, dubbed the Red Summer. The powder keg of racial tension was no doubt exacerbated by the release of The Birth of a Nation a few years before. In 1915, a film called The Birth of a Nation was released. It would be Hollywood's most popular and commercially successful film until 1939 when Gone with the Wind was released. The film, which was presented as an accurate representation of fact, told a story of black people living in the South, specifically North Carolina. At the beginning of the film, before slavery was ended, it depicted white people and black people kind of coexisting and even helping each other, though black people were shown dancing around and almost acting like children. The plot of the movie begins with the horrors of the Civil War and then moves on to how the free black slaves supposedly behaved right after they won their freedom in North Carolina. It showed them refusing to work, being rude to white people, intimidating white people, living off government handouts, and forming and joining all black militia groups in order to terrorize the peaceful white population for no particular reason. It shows the House of Representatives with only black men who are drinking alcohol out of a flask, taking off their shoes, putting their feet and their shoes up on the desk, throwing things, and eating fried chicken, before ruling on the fact that white people now have to salute black soldiers and legalizing interracial marriage. It then showed the legislators staring lasciviously at the white women in the crowd in the balcony. The film overtly states that this scene is a true representation of the House of Representatives in North Carolina in 1870. It was not. In the film, our protagonist, Ben Cameron, an anti-abolitionist, declares that the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan is necessary, as they were the ones that saved the South from the anarchy of black rule during Reconstruction. So he revives the KKK and begins recruiting white men to serve. The white Klansmen then attack a black man that is burning the barn of a white farmer. Congressman Stoneman, the northern abolitionist and antagonist, is furious and declares, "We shall crush the white South under the heel of the black South," and forces his daughter Elsie to break off her engagement to Ben Cameron. Elsie is then proposed to by a black man named Gus because interracial marriage is legal now, but she refuses. In a rage, he chases her to the edge of a cliff with the implied intention of raping her, and so she jumps off the cliff rather than be defiled by the black man. Elsie's hurt, but she doesn't die. Ben Cameron, her former fiancé, with the help of the Klan, murders Gus and leaves him on the steps of Governor Lynch's house. Lynch is, of course, a black man. Infuriated, Governor Lynch tells all the black militia to take to the streets and kill anyone with Klan paraphernalia in their home. Governor Lynch summons Stoneman, telling him he wishes to marry a white woman. At first, Stoneman is thrilled, but Lynch informs him it is Elsie he wishes to marry. Suddenly, Stoneman is vehemently against the marriage. This is when our antagonist comes around to the protagonist's side, having grown as a person into the racist everyone knew he could be. Now, Stoneman sides with Cameron, and Lynch is determined to murder them both and marry Elsie. Elsie goes to Lynch and begs him not to kill her father, and he drunkenly tells her that he won't kill her father if she marries him, and she will be queen of his new black empire. She agrees. Stoneman is abducted by the black militia, tied up, and forced to watch the wedding. Then Cameron, the former fiancé and KKK leader, appears on horseback in all his sheet-covered racist glory to save the white people of the town from the black militia, who are terrorizing the poor townsfolk and setting things on fire. Once the militia is slain, he makes a dramatic sprint to save Elsie from the unspeakable horrors of being married to a black man. The film ends with the remaining black people all being scared and the white Klansmen physically intimidating them to prevent them from voting. So the white candidates can return the government to its rightful state. Finally, a little bit of truth in the end. I understand this isn't the film review hour, but in a time where people were kept relatively ignorant about current events outside of their immediate vicinity, this movie was dangerous propaganda that portrayed the KKK as the cavalry, paving the way for their resurrection that very same year, and portrayed the freedmen as barbarians and parasites. It was a blatant assault on racial relations and a box office smash hit. At one point, Birth of a Nation was able to draw an audience that was willing to pay $2.20, which at the time was equivalent to $50 in today's money. The film's publicists sold Klan-themed merchandise to theatergoers and hired actors dressed in Ku Klux Klan costumes to greet people at the theaters. It was the first film to ever be screened at the White House. And after watching the film, Woodrow Wilson said that it was like, quote, writing history with lightning, referring to films in general, and that he found it sad that the content of the film was so true. Woodrow Wilson arguably set the civil rights movement back by a decade or more. The Ku Klux Klan, which had been eradicated in 1872 by Ulysses S. Grant, was brought back to life by William Joseph Simmons of Georgia. The film was actually responsible for one of the most infamous practices of the KKK, cross-burning. The cross-burning was never something that the original KKK had done. That was something that W.D. Griffith had used in the movie for theatrical effect. But the new KKK happily adopted it. In fact, the film was used in recruitment propaganda to make people feel like they were the heroes protecting the world from the evils of the black man. Unlike the original Ku Klux Klan, this new KKK brought into its tenets not just white superiority over black people, but white superiority over every other group that anyone had a problem with. This included Jews, Catholics, and immigrants of any kind. They also were staunchly anti-prohibition and were extremely involved in subverting the laws during that time. In 1925, the Ku Klux Klan had 5 million members, which was approximately 5% of the entire U.S. population. I'm thinking that those numbers were probably heavily influenced by Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933, because at the end of Prohibition, their numbers plummeted. I also want to make it clear we're not just talking about the South anymore. The North was heavily influenced by this film, and racial relations there took a significant hit as well. So this brings us to 1918, the year that Mary Turner was lynched. It's been a long road, so just to refresh, a debt peon had shot a white farmer, which led to a white mob lynching at least 13 black people and culminated in the death of Mary Turner and her baby. The debt peon's name was Sidney Johnson. Out of curiosity, I looked up what Johnson was arrested for in the first place, to end up in debt peonage. He was gaming, or throwing dice on the sidewalk. Prohibition would be in place from 1920 to 1933. During that time, Florida became the first state to end the convict leasing program. They were prompted by the death of a 22-year-old man named Martin Tabert. Tabert, who was originally from North Dakota but had left home to see the world, had been arrested on December 15, 1921, for hopping a train in Florida. He was fined $25, roughly $450 in today's money, but he couldn't pay the fine, so he was sentenced to 90 days in county jail. He was leased to Putnam Lumber Company at the rate of $20 a month. Before being turned over to Putnam Lumber, Tabert had telegrammed home to request $50 to pay his fine, as well as the first month that Putnam Lumber paid for his lease. The telegram reached his family, who mailed a letter directly to the Leon County Sheriff containing a bank draft for $7,500 requesting the immediate release of their son and no change back, if you know what I mean. The letter was returned, unopened, the following week. Tabert was dead within 6 weeks. If you have a sensitive disposition to graphic details, I would recommend skipping ahead about a minute. The exact details of the death weren't recorded, so the family was fed lies and excuses until July of 1922, when they received a letter from a man named Glenn Thompson. Thompson told them that if they had the stomach to hear it, he could tell them about their son's death. The following letter from Thompson said he had witnessed many tortures in the convict camp. Tabert's feet were swollen due to the swampy conditions of the worksite and the poor quality of his shoes. When he asked the whipping boss, Walter Higginbotham, for another pair of shoes, he refused, and this interaction likely landed him on Higginbotham's bad side. The day of his death, Tabert went to the doctor complaining of sore testicles. Reports from other prisoners stated they worked in waist-deep swamp water and lived in wet clothes, resulting in sores all over their body. The doctor lanced one testicle and provided Tabert with some antibiotics. Despite his condition, Tabert was sent back to work. Shortly after his return to the site, he was given a severe beating for working too slowly. Higginbotham reportedly gave him 35 to 55 lashings with one implement before switching to a larger implement, a 4-inch strap weighing about 7.5 pounds, and giving him roughly 85 more lashings. When Tabert begged him to stop, Higginbotham stepped on Tabert's neck with his boot, both to silence him and keep him still while the whipping continued. When the beating was done, Tabert was put back to work. He worked for a brief period before suddenly dying without a struggle. This is just one of many tales of depravity and brutality experienced by prisoners under the convict leasing program, but this one made a ripple. The resulting outcry and backlash from the community, none louder than his family, skyrocketed this story into national newspapers. To escape the hellfire being rained down upon them, Florida was compelled to shut down its convict leasing program in 1923. Martin Tabert has since been praised as a hero and a martyr for victims of convict leasing throughout history. There was nothing that set this beating or this death apart from what prisoners had been experiencing for the past 12 years, except, of course, that Martin Tabert was white. Alabama was the last state to end convict leasing in 1928. Who knows how many other Martin Taberts there were in those 5 long years. In 1930, W.D. Du Bois, an influential black civil rights activist who had been fighting for the end of Jim Crow and segregation, became a leading proponent of segregated schools. The anti-segregationist movement was in full swing by this time, and the appearance that they were losing influence to the other side caused quite a stir. However, Du Bois did this with the intention of providing any education, even if it was a segregated one, to the next generation of black leaders. Another prominent leader in the civil rights movement in the 1930s was Charles Hamilton Houston. After seeing all the failures of different strategies through the years, including the failure of Walter White's anti-lynching bill, Houston also decided to work within the restrictions of segregation to propagate qualified black teachers. Walter White, as Professor Aiello mentioned in his summary of the lynching of Mary Turner, was one of the early leaders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, established in 1909. He was, visually, a white man, but there were African American genes in his ancestry, and so he would proclaim himself to be a black man. White worked to expose lynchers and bring them to justice, particularly those of Mary Turner, and had the goal of getting an anti-lynching bill passed. When he did finally get the bill into Congress, it failed to pass. Throughout history, including the 21st century, there have been 200 anti-lynching bills submitted to Congress. Not a single one has passed. Congress's argument is that anti-lynching is simply anti-murder, and there are sufficient laws with regards to murder. However, by making lynching illegal specifically, it would put it under federal jurisdiction and not prosecuted by the state. Houston lobbied for the creation of many of the very first black primary and secondary schools, the equal quality of those institutions to those of white students, as well as the equal education for the male and female students. While black boys, probably for the first time, were getting access to traditional education, such as mathematics and science, black girls were strictly being taught homemaking skills. They were both getting this education in a dilapidated shack, but once they graduated the dilapidated shack, the opportunities for those girls ended. This also meant that black teachers, because teachers were primarily women at this time, were in short supply. Some educators were brave enough to teach their young black female students traditional subjects in secret when they were supposed to be making dresses, allowing the next generation of teachers to have more black educators amongst them. The influence of Du Bois and Houston helped establish many segregated schools for exclusively African American students over the next 20 years. By 1954, when segregation in schools was officially outlawed, access to education had become available to every student in major urban areas. While progress was being made on the political front in the 1930s, the average black American in the South was struggling through the Great Depression. When the Great Depression hit the South, unemployment for the black community was already at 70% due to employer access to labor through debt peonage, as well as industrialized advances in farming that replaced human labor. Franklin D. Roosevelt implemented his New Deal policy, the first government aid program in American history. In particular, the terms of the policy should have provided aid to the black population. However, loopholes and technicalities were sniffed out and exploited by the South in order to ensure that black people were suddenly not entitled to any of these benefits. This made them particularly desperate and exploitable. One way to make some cash would be to take part in scientific experiments. In 1932, 600 African American men from Macon County, Alabama, took part in what was called the untreated syphilis study at Tuskegee. All of the participants were tested for syphilis. Of the group, 399 total had it and 201 did not. Those who had syphilis were told that they were being treated for bad blood, which was a term used to describe any number of ailments in the 1930s, and they were promised that if they took part in the study, they would receive free medical care, free meals, and burial insurance. The men were not aware that they were not being treated at all, as was the purpose of the study. Ethical issues were already apparent, but this study made history among the worst instances of human experimentation when penicillin became widely available in 1943. Despite being aware of this, the researchers chose not to treat them and allowed them to die in order to record the progression of the disease. What finally ended the practice of debt peonage and opened up employment opportunities in the South was World War II. In 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt asked his advisors what America would most likely be judged for should it come under attack in a propaganda war. They told him it was their treatment of black people. In response, Roosevelt amended all of the applicable laws to change any uses of the indentured servant, convict labor, or debt peon to slavery, thus making these practices illegal and coming with all of the consequences thereof. With World War II also came the second wave of the Great Migration, bringing the black population in the South down from 77% to 52%. Once the war ended, the northern white veterans reacted much the same way as after the first migration, and racial violence followed. In addition to competition for jobs, the North also started experiencing a housing shortage. Both waves of the Great Migration took a toll on the South. The workforce was dwindling for Southern agriculture, and so the white employers took steps to prevent black workers from leaving, both physically and with the use of propaganda materials about how conditions in the North are even worse than down here. With the competition for resources at an all-time high and still no recourse for black victims of violence, that wasn't all that untrue. In many cases, they were left with a choice to leave what they know and have adapted to over the years for the unknown, which could be even worse. The official last black slave in the U.S. was freed in September of 1942. His name was Alfred Irving. He was 42 years old and had been held by a farmer and his daughter for at least 4 years. They had kept Irving in chains and out of sight on their isolated farm near Houston, Texas, to avoid having to free him. When he was discovered, Irving was malnourished and had been beaten so badly with chains that he'd become permanently disfigured. The farmer was sentenced to 4 years in prison, and his daughter was sentenced to 2. In the 60-some-odd years that followed, many survivors have said they don't believe for a minute that was the last black slave. 4 years later, the last recorded lynching happened in Georgia. 2 couples, George and Mae Dorsey and Dorothy and Roger Malcolm, were lynched near Moore's Ford Bridge in Walton County, Georgia. Dorothy Malcolm was 7 months pregnant. Professor Tom Aiello had this to say on the subject.
The last recorded lynching happened in 1946 in Moore's Ford. It was in Georgia, lynching of a couple off of a bridge known as the Moore's Ford Bridge. Now, that's not to say that. There are plenty of people who say with good argument that George Floyd was lynched. And so there are ways to see lynching in other ways, but by the way we define it historically, as mob violence of white people against people of color in some kind of generically individual setting, it was 1946, and it was a few hours away from Valdosta. All right, everybody listening will know someone who was alive the last time that lynching happened in the United States. It is not long ago. It is very recent.
In 1948, President Harry S. Truman, who had won the presidency on a platform of civil rights and equality for all, desegregated the United States Armed Forces, any form of national transportation, and any other federal institutions which he had the power to desegregate. The industries of sports and entertainment broadcasted these sweeping changes to the world. For the first time, black athletes were showing people what they could do, and films were telling stories with thoughtfully written and representative black characters. Barbara Ann Johns, a 16-year-old high school student attending Robert Russa Moton High School in Farmville, Virginia, led the very first student strike in history in 1951. Robert Russa Moton High School was a segregated black school that was falling apart, and the resources for students were outdated and of poor quality. The students were petitioning for a better school, not only for them, but for all black students. The superintendent of schools came to disperse the students, telling them their parents would be fired and put in prison if they didn't end their strike. Barbara replied, "There are a lot of us here. How big is your prison?" Of course, the event was eventually disbanded, and in the fallout, the school principal, who hadn't done anything wrong except get bamboozled by teenage activists, lost his job. The Johns family received countless threats, and both of Barbara's parents lost their jobs. After a cross was burned on their front lawn, Barbara was sent to Alabama for her own safety. In solidarity, the NAACP took up Barbara's plight, bringing the issue with the support of the community to the Supreme Court, who ruled in their favor, and schools officially became desegregated in 1954. Just because this change was forced upon them doesn't mean that white people accepted it. Some southern states simply refused to integrate. Other states chose to shut down their schools before they would allow black students to attend them. Black principals and teachers lost their jobs because white parents would begrudgingly accept black students learning beside their children, but they would not allow their child to learn from a black educator. In 1963, 4 black churches were bombed over 11 days following the federal government order to integrate school systems in Alabama. 4 people died in the bombings. There are still 70 years of institutional racism to come after Jim Crow ended. In 1955, the civil rights movement reached a boiling point when Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old seamstress and secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, refused to give her seat on the bus to a white man. Due to segregation laws, black passengers were required to use the seats at the back of the bus if there were white riders on the bus. By refusing, Parks got herself arrested, capturing the attention of the NAACP and the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was led by an up-and-coming civil rights activist, Martin Luther King Jr. To show his support for Parks, King spearheaded a boycott on the city's bus company, which primarily provided transportation to black patrons. The boycott lasted nearly a year, and the company narrowly avoided bankruptcy. King and 90 other participants were indicted under a law which forbade conspiracy to obstruct the operation of a business. The decision was appealed and made its way up to the Supreme Court, where the segregated seating policy was found to be unconstitutional. As I mentioned a moment ago, a series of churches were bombed in Alabama in resistance to the integration of schools. The final bombing was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was, at the time, home to one of the strongest and most violent chapters of the Ku Klux Klan. In response, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, who we discussed briefly in Part 1 of The Boy and the Mat, led by Martin Luther King Jr., began the Birmingham Campaign. The purpose was to bring further attention to desegregation efforts in the South. King had been arrested at one of the demonstrations, and from prison he wrote a letter detailing the brutality and bloodshed of activists involved in the campaign. The letter, along with images, were published in the national press. Photographs of children being attacked by police dogs and women being knocked off their feet with fire hoses built crucial support around the world for the civil rights movement in America. 1963 was the same year as King's famous I Have a Dream speech, which would make history. Largely due to the nonviolent resistance championed by Martin Luther King Jr. in the late 1950s through early 1960s, on July 2, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, and the year following, he signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act ended segregation in public places and prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This included both for employment and providing services. The Voting Rights Act banned the use of literacy tests for voter eligibility, a huge hurdle facing Black Americans, provided federal oversight of voter registration in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population is registered to vote, and authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections. This milestone was overshadowed in the media, however, by the Mississippi burning murders. Civil rights organizations in the northern states had urged white students to travel to Mississippi to provide humanitarian aid to the Black residents there. Duties would include helping to register them as voters and build new schools for the Black children. Within days of the Freedom Summer, as it was called, beginning, 3 volunteers mysteriously vanished. Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, 2 young white students from New York, and James Chaney, a local Black student, were apparently on their way back from investigating the burning of a Black church, a common tactic of the KKK, when they disappeared. According to the county sheriff's deputy, the 3 men had been arrested on their way home for a traffic violation, but released at 10 p.m. Their car was found a few days later, abandoned, most likely concealed, in a thick, brushy area. The boys stayed missing until August 4, 1964, during which time search efforts discovered the separate bodies of 3 Black men, all of whom had been lynched. The bodies of the missing volunteers were discovered in an earthen dam near Philadelphia, Mississippi. The FBI investigation would come to find that when the 3 men were released from jail, they were followed by the arresting deputy, who was also in cahoots with the sheriff and 2 other deputies. Altogether, 9 men were in the group of scumbags that pursued the boys. Once they had exited city limits, the arresting deputy pulled them over again. It's unknown why they cooperated, but I think it's safe to assume they were just terrified not to. They followed the deputy down a county road and into a secluded intersection. They were shot and killed before being loaded back into their own vehicle and driven to where they were found. At least 1 had also been tortured, and another 1 buried alive. 21 men were accused of being involved by the FBI. 19 men were indicted. Charges were dropped for 3, 9 were indicted, and 7 were found guilty by an all-white jury in Jackson, Mississippi. The victory was bittersweet. None of those 7 men served more than 6 years behind bars. In 1967, the Supreme Court ruled that laws banning interracial marriage were unconstitutional after Mildred and Richard Loving got married in Virginia in 1958. On July 11, 1958, the Lovings were laying in their honeymoon bed when police began banging on their door at 2 a.m. Police demanded to know the nature of their relationship, and they both were arrested. Richard was bonded out the following day, but Mildred spent 3 days in jail. In court, the couple was told if they didn't leave the state of Virginia, they would both spend 25 years in prison. They spent the next 9 years exiled, fighting for their marriage all the way up to the Supreme Court so they could not only be legally married, but also because they could see their families still in Virginia. In April of 1968, the last great legislative achievements of the Civil Rights era was put in place. The Fair Housing Act prohibited refusal to sell, rent, or finance housing units based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Ultimately, this would take several years to become a positive for the Black community. With more African American homeowners and tenants in the cities, the white population began moving away from the cities and into the suburbs, taking with them employment opportunities the Black residents needed. This led to an increase in low-income areas, or ghettos, which are still a low-income trap for people of color to this day. As if that wasn't enough of a blow, April of 1968 is also when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Burning, looting, and riots followed in the days after his death from a disenchanted community that saw their commitment to nonviolent resistance met with violence again and again. In the following years, Black people felt the tide was turning against the civil rights movement, but it continued to evolve. Over the next several decades, as integration became the normal way of life to younger generations, the disparity became more blurred and ignorance became more prevalent. Widespread issues with police brutality under modern expectations have been happening non-stop since the 1990s. But it's only with the recent social media explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement that attention has really been drawn to it. The point we've tried to make with this episode is that a race doesn't heal from 300 years of scars in a few generations. Even now, as I hope most of us try to make reparations, many of us don't even realize that after the Civil War, after the supposed freeing of the Black slaves, things didn't get better. Actually, and I acknowledge I am not qualified to say this for sure, it kind of seems like things got a lot worse before they started to improve. Every victory went hand in hand with tragedy. Every fight for well-being was a death sentence for someone. I've never lost a child, but those who have say there is nothing worse. It doesn't seem like much of a stretch to think that nothing worse could be even worse when you lose a child under mysterious circumstances in a town where a white person has never been convicted of murdering a Black person. With the generational trauma that the Johnsons have inherited, can they be blamed for being so desperate to find an answer that doesn't terrify them that they're willing to look outside the confines of probability? We'll leave you today with these words from Professor Aiello.
You cannot understand the United States and you cannot understand Canada without understanding the Afro-American and Afro-Canadian population and the indigenous populations. And if you don't understand both of those two groups, you don't understand either one of our countries. So learn about them. Learn about those problems. They have problems that you'll never experience, but they are so important to understand because people you care about have to go to bed at night with ways of thinking that you'll never have to.